Welcome to all of you in this room. I know there are many rooms you could be in right now, and you've chosen to come here because of your interest in Lebanon. And welcome also to all of the people around the world who are watching this live on live stream, but also to the people who are going to watch this afterwards. Our session today is titled very simply, Toward Stability in Lebanon. And the sad reality, you all know this, is we could have a session with this title almost at any point in the last 5 or 6 years. And so, again, all of you know this, but Lebanon's crisis is particularly severe right now because it is built on a political crisis. This is a country that has not had a head of state in more than 2 years. It is built on a fiscal crisis. This is a country that has about 80% of its population living in poverty. Its savings have tanked for people who invested in banks. The pound has been decimated. And on top of all of that, again, as everyone in this region knows all too well, since September, when Israel escalated its attacks on Hezbollah and began to target even civilian populations, civilian areas with direct raids, there's been a real decimation of of society and the public sector. More than 2,700 people have been killed and 1.2 million people displaced. This really is a polycrisis. And the question then is, what can Beirut do from here? So enough from me here. I'm going to introduce our panel, and then I'm going to push all of them towards solutions, and I will bring you all in. To my left, His Excellency Nasser Yassin, he's the Caretaker Minister of the Environment. He's also the head of the Government Emergency Committee of Lebanon. To his left, Ms. Lama Fakih, she is Director for the Middle East and North Africa at Human Rights Watch. And to her left, Mr. Paul Salem, he's Vice President for International Engagement at the Middle East Institute. Let's just have a quick round of applause for our guests, please. Thank you all for being here. Lama, I'm going to start with you. Just very quickly, if you could sketch out a sense of how things are on the ground, how dire things are. And I promise I will move us towards solutions after that. But a quick snapshot from you, please.
Thank you, Ravi. Obviously, the situation in Lebanon has escalated quite dramatically since September of this year. But as you noted, the hostilities have to be understood in the broader context of the multiple crises that the country has been going through, and the broader war that has been taking place in the country since October 2023. And since the start of the hostilities in October 2023, we have seen that the security situation in the country obviously has deteriorated significantly. A range of violations perpetrated by Israeli forces, and this contributed even months before the current escalation to widespread displacement from villages in the south, to people losing their livelihoods, not being able to access agricultural lands and their livestock. More recently, obviously, all of these things have become much more acute. And since the escalation began in September, we have seen a real desperation from the civilian population in being able to access basic services and security. For many people, there was really nothing that they could do to protect themselves in the areas where they were sheltering because of the conduct of hostilities. This escalation has resulted in extreme losses when it comes to the health sector. We have seen that ambulances, first responders, hospitals have all been impacted by the crisis. Broader infrastructure has been severely damaged. We have a number of towns and villages where people cannot access sewage lines, electricity, fresh water, roads have been damaged and destroyed. All of this will require quite a lot of investment when we think about how people can move back into areas where they have been displaced from. And then, of course, there are some villages that continue to be occupied, and so there are still broader questions around, the political developments and what will happen in those spaces.
Lama, thank you for that. Minister Yassin, you've been in the government now for 3 years and a few months. There's a long history of the government letting its people down in Lebanon. There's a long history of corruption, and through that period, you were a critic of the government. You were a think tanker. You've written a lot about what's going on, and then you decided to join government, I'm guessing to try and make a difference. Have you been able to build trust in government, and how depleted is government right now?
Thank you, Ravi. This is a very interesting question, because this is at the heart of what we were trying to do in the past couple of months in responding to the aggression of the Israeli-occupied forces on Lebanon. But let me step a bit, one step back, and given your statement, which I don't object, but the description of the panel, because you need to put things in context, otherwise things become not nuanced and might look over theoretical. Imagine, and many perhaps from the audience are from the US or following from the US, you have 83 million of your people being displaced in 48 hours. God forbid, but let's imagine this as a scenario, and this is done by an alien, let's say an alien force, to put it this way. Imagine this happens in 48 hours, this quarter of the population moving from one area to the other. It was very quick, very speedy, due to an aggressive nature, unprecedented level of attacks and destruction being faced in few days. And then imagine people moving to geographic areas so narrow, so small, that's been hosting, imagine this in the US, another 100 million refugees from a neighboring country. This is the context we are working in. I'm not dramatizing, but this is the real context. But we tried in the midst of...
I have to say, the math here is with the United States. So you multiplied Lebanon's population by what, 26? And you could then multiply Hezbollah's population by 26 and arrive at the same set of hypotheticals.
But of course, definitely. And you can multiply the amount of money put from the US into this.
I got the math wrong, 70 something times.
You can multiply all the money put in this war by world leading countries in this war. But let me go back to your question. But we managed, in the midst of a poly crisis, as you put it, in the midst of an economic and financial and a political impasse that we've been going through, to actually create a working system to serve people who've been in displacement. Of course, the first and foremost objective of the response that we were doing in the last few months is to save lives and to give the least possible means to put people in shelter and provide food, medicine, and any kind of support in their displacement. This is a quarter of the population being displaced. And in the midst of everything, our key concern that we were building trust with government. We were building trust between population and the Lebanese state that has been deteriorated and has been depleted in the past years or even decades. And we did manage to create this trust to a certain degree by stressing on the central role of government from the smallest unit in the response at the municipal level to the actually, Council of Ministers. And we did work with the UN agencies to regain trust with them through a joint humanitarian response. We did work with bilaterally, particularly with Arab countries and other countries, and all appreciation to Qatar and other bilaterally in-kind aid, but also through government entities as much as possible. And I think this was a key step forward. In order to regain trust, you have to put forward the government in terms of the response and later in the reconstruction and early recovery. So if really we want to work on regaining the government of Lebanon's sovereignty all over the land of Lebanon and to serve everybody, we need to have, trust in all the efforts we've been trying to do. And this is what we managed to a certain degree. We created this with full transparency and accountability. We managed to create, platforms that show everything we got from other countries and everything we received financially or in kind. And we published everything we sent to the communities, displaced communities all over the country. And we're continuing to do so at the moment with the early recovery and reconstruction efforts. So yes, it's been challenging. It's not been easy to move from being a think tanker to the government. Of course, it's easy to be critical, and that's our job as academic and think tankers, but there are decent people in government, and this is my last point. There are decent people at the civil service in the country. There are decent people in the Lebanese armed forces and in the Syrian administration who are trying their best in very, meager salaries they receive in order to, keep things moving in the country. It's not a failed state. And
I mean,
it's not going to be a failed state. We're working hard to prevent the failure of the systems in Lebanon. They're fragile indeed. We have very fragile systems, given everything happening in the last few years. But the message here that we can make it, if we manage to do it in the midst of the most aggressive war in the history of Lebanon in the past few months, in coordinating and working towards a humanitarian response that we did early recovery, we can manage to do it in reconstruction and rebuilding the state.
And Minister, the question is how, and I think that's what I want to try and have this panel focus on. Paul, let me bring you in. Again, this analogy that we began with of the numbers and how imagine if this was the United States, this would be so much bigger. But again, I mean, if were you to use that analogy across the board, then it doesn't paint as pretty a picture because the problems would be Paul, just to move us towards solutions, what are the things that Beirut, but also globally, the international community needs to begin with to move Lebanon towards stability?
Thank you, Ravi. Good to see everybody here today. I want to focus on the way forward, as you said, and look briefly at 4 tracks: the humanitarian, the security, the political, and the economic. Minister Yassin, and I salute all of his efforts. As he said, there are some excellent people in government and the administration doing the best they can. There's been massive displacement, there's massive needs, and that certainly requires a lot of regional, international help to support the people who've been displaced in this way. They need $6 to $8 billion for full reconstruction, and that to the degree that the current even caretaker government with international support can do that right away. These people are very needy, and winter is already upon us, so that's very important. On the security side, Lebanon has just signed a cessation of hostilities agreement built on UN Security Council Resolution 1701. On the security side, the role of the Lebanese army now is critical. Lebanese army is already deploying in the south, and it needs to do that intensively along with the UNIFIL forces. It needs to behave like the national army and needs to take the agreement that Lebanon signed on to seriously and to make sure that the Lebanese army and the UNIFIL are the only armed forces south of the Litani. With what's happening in Syria as well, the Lebanese army is deploying on the borders between Lebanon and Syria to prevent the conflict in Syria spilling over into Lebanon. And that's a whole other complicated set of scenarios that everybody is watching very closely. The Lebanese army has also taken control of the Lebanese airport, which the state has not controlled for many years. And hopefully consolidating its control of the Lebanese port, the seaport. Lebanon lost its sovereignty 55 years ago in 1969, and I think Lebanon has a chance to regain that sovereignty. And for the Lebanese army and the Lebanese state to be the only armed group in the country. And this will be a challenge for the internal politics of the country. Obviously, Hezbollah has agreed to withdraw from areas south of the Litani, but has not yet agreed to integrate into the Lebanese state and so on, but that is probably a conversation that needs to happen. On the political side, the road is clear and necessary. There is a session set on January 9 to elect the president. As you indicated, there hasn't been one for more than 2 years. So there has been a caretaker government doing the best it can, but now more than ever, the country needs a president, and not any president. It needs a president who has a strong sovereign stance and believes in the sovereignty of the Lebanese state, the Lebanese people's right to have sovereignty, and a president who is reform-oriented, who is not corrupt and will not tolerate corruption to the degree that he or she can make that stance. That hopefully will happen on or after January 9. That urgently needs to happen. Followed quickly by the designation of an equally sovereign and reform-minded prime minister and the formation of a similarly sovereign and reform-minded government. The work that a Lebanese government needs to do, and I think you listed it in the very beginning, is enormous. From rebuilding sovereignty, rebuilding the state institutions, rebuilding public finances. So the work to be done is enormous. And the political path forward, president, prime minister, government, is clear as well. The friends of Lebanon are numerous around the world and in the region, so Lebanon does not lack for friends. If it gets its state house in order, it will find tremendous support for its sovereignty, for its reforms, and so on. The fourth pillar, of course, is the economy. As you indicated, the economy completely collapsed in 2019. Then we had the port blast, then we had 13 months of war, and then 4 months of intensive war. And so it's been going from bad to worse. The banks are effectively bankrupt and closed effectively. The Lebanese currency, you've mentioned all of that. So with a functioning, hopefully a functioning government, the rebuilding of stability and sovereignty, then there will be necessary work to re-engineer the banking system, merge a lot of the banks, refloat some of them to have a functioning banking system, stabilize the public finances on a much smaller budgetary basis for the Lebanese state, and then begin a period of growth. I think if those basics are done, I'm not fearful for the future of the Lebanese economy if you get the basics right. The Lebanese population and investors and businesses are very well known. They're also all over the world. And as I said, friends of Lebanon in terms of private investors will also, I think, find a lot of opportunities in Lebanon. If you get the governance and banking and security right, I would see potentially a bright future. Obviously, all of this is very complex. There could be a lot of pitfalls. It could fail right away, but I do see a way forward potentially.
Paul, I have to say, until that last sentence, I was going to say you're the most optimistic man I know. You're basically saying if we build a state from scratch in X, Y, and Z areas, then there's a very
well,
bright
you did
future.
ask me what needs to be done.
That's true.
What needs to. We might fail on all of them, but
That's true.
Pointing it out.
Let's go to the immediate short-term, Lama, with you, just in terms of the immense humanitarian crisis with so many people being forced to live in shelters, in tents. You've got the migration crisis also from Syria, which has been both in and then out and now in again. What are the immediate things that you think the international community needs to focus on beyond reforming government and the private and the banking sector and all of that?
Thanks, Ravi. And Paul, thank you for that helpful framework. If I may, I'll add one additional pillar to your 4 pillars, which is the pillar of accountability. And in Lebanon, we have long had a rule of law crisis. The absence of accountability for serious crimes, human rights violations, and crimes during times of war is something that did not start in the current hostilities, but is something that is ongoing. And in the absence of accountability, we will not have stability. And there are things that need to be done at the local and international level to advance accountability. There have been drafts on improving the independence of the judiciary in Parliament for some time. Those drafts need to advance into legislation that, in fact, allows us to have an independent judiciary domestically. We have been pressing the Lebanese government to take steps to accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. This would allow the court to investigate crimes that have been perpetrated in Lebanon and from Lebanon since October of last year. There were steps taken to do so in April, which unfortunately the government has since retracted. And again, we urge them to do this as a pathway for civilians in Lebanon to access justice for crimes perpetrated against them. We heard this morning from a group of journalists who were unlawfully targeted in Israeli strikes in Lebanon. They deserve justice. More broadly, reparations should be paid out. The Lebanese government will not be able to shoulder the economic burden. Not one state should be reimbursing families. There needs to be an accounting for the harm that was done. And this is why we also continue to urge the establishment, first, to have a special session on Lebanon at the Human Rights Council, and the establishment of a fact-finding mechanism that could more thoroughly investigate the violations of international law that have taken place in the context of these hostilities. And while there is a ceasefire, we know that abuses continue to take place. The humanitarian needs are immense. I will touch on just a few things. I mean, we talked already about infrastructure. We have a problem now of unexploded ordnance that needs to be cleared from towns and villages across the south, in the Bekaa, in Beirut and the Beirut suburbs. We have an education crisis. Education was already in crisis prior to the current hostilities, and now students in Lebanon have lost even more time. We know that it's not just a function of rebuilding schools and opening of schools, but ensuring that the curriculum is set in such a way that kids can make up for the time lost, that teachers are appropriately trained and appropriately compensated. And we touched as well on the issue of hospitals and the medical response, which has been so deeply impacted by the current hostilities and by the crisis before.
Minister, you've just heard some really dire sort of descriptions of your country. Also, frankly, a lack of faith in government, a call for accountability that doesn't seem to be in place. I don't want to put you on the defensive anymore. I realize that, again, you're a former think tanker who is trying to help your country in government. So putting aside pointing fingers, what does your government need to try and stabilize itself in the medium term?
Very good. No, never on the defensive, don't worry. No, I fully agree with the roadmap. I mean, this is what we've been working on. Of course, in the midst of a political impasse, not getting a president and not electing a president for the last 2 years, and almost not functioning parliament because of the divisions in parliament. But I don't see that we are starting from scratch. And I think this is the difference when you see it from outside and you see it from inside. There were a lot of attempts in the past couple of years or the past 3 years in reforming some sectors. And there are some, again, pockets in the Lebanese state and in the Lebanese government that have been working in a quite decent way.
Minister, if I may, you're getting defensive again.
No,
Let's push towards solutions.
No, this is the solution. No, this is not defensive. This is the solution. The solution is start from where we are. To start from islands in the Lebanese landscape where things have been working. I'll give you an example from sectors I've been working on as Minister of Environment for the last 3 years, reforming the quarry sector in Lebanon and pushing for the dues from this quarry sector that's been not, collected for the past 20 years or so was reforming different sectors related to the environment is not a defensive thing. This is the way forward. We need to start from what we have rather than sit on the fence and actually...
But how?
In the Lebanese state, there are decent people in civil service. I mentioned this a couple of times. There are people who want to work. There are people who want to reform the Lebanese government in different entities. The army is trying to function in the midst of the most severe economic crisis. This is where we start. We start from what we have rather than just theorize about change from abroad. There was a grave mistake that was done in 2020 after the Beirut blast when we actually shot ourselves in the foot by by actually sidelining the Lebanese state and its different institutions, including the civil servant. This is the de-Baathification approach that can be used in different governments and different states shouldn't be used anymore, because you collapse the whole state altogether. You need to build on what exists. From the accountability and oversight bodies that exist in the country, there are decent judges, there are decent civil servants, there are decent army generals, and this is where we need to start.
Well, but you still haven't found the perpetrators of the Beirut blast. There's been no accountability. And you've been in government for 3 years.
No, we've been pushing for this, and this is going to continue, and this is going to happen sooner or later, And this is what I mean. There are setbacks, there are pushbacks, but you need to keep going, and you need to build on those pockets that exist, and this is where you grow into connecting all these dots together. Overhauling the whole system altogether is not going to work. You need to go gradually, step by step, in order to rebuild the Lebanese state. Of course, you need a president, a functioning parliament, a functioning government. These are must. But there, again and again, there are places where you can start in the Lebanese state. And this is my message. Don't actually sideline everything together and say, I need a complete overhaul. You need to start and begin from what exists. And this is where we can grow gradually into having the roadmap that Paul has put.
I am not calling for an overhaul, but I will point out we need more urgency than what you're describing, given that 80% of your country lives in poverty. Paul, I'm going to give you the last word. From everything you've heard here, do you think government as it stands is equipped to deal with the crisis it's confronted with, or what kind of external support should it be getting?
Well, I do want to point out that the primary politicians that dominate the current parliament were elected a couple of years ago, but they, in the main part, are part of a corrupt, semi-criminal, oligarchic operation. There are wonderful people in government and in the army and in the civil service and so on. That's absolutely true, and a very vibrant civil society. But the key bosses still in the high echelons, if you want to use that term, of the big decision makers, on the whole, are a big part of the problem of absence of accountability, deeply mired in corruption, and hence it will take a long time to process towards a different structure. I did point out the near-term objectives. Yes, the choice of a president is up to Parliament. It is this Parliament. It's not the most ideal Parliament. But I'm sure a lot of Lebanese, like myself and others in the international community, are urging for a more sovereign president, more anti-corruption president, similar with the prime minister and the government. I hope that many of the groups in the country are now aware that they need the government in order to get the international aid and so on and so forth. But I would also point out that there's a lot that's up to the Lebanese public and the Lebanese voting public. We have elections in less than 2 years. Generally, these elections are pretty open. While Hezbollah was dominating the south in the areas that they dominated, it was not free. But in most other areas of the countries, it was. And I think there's a lot up to Lebanese voters, Lebanese civil society, new parties to emerge, to seize the opportunity of the next elections, to have more change in the Lebanese parliament than we saw 2 years ago. I will point out that Lebanon has been a constitutional, power-sharing, flawed democracy for 100 years, since 1926. Yes, it's had problems, it's had issues, it's not ideal, but that I agree with Minister Yassin, there's a considerable amount to build on. So I've laid out the roadmap. I think the Friends of Lebanon should, encourage, help, press, the Lebanese state and the government and the parliament to move in that direction. I fully agree with what Lama said about accountability. The international communities, judicial and the criminal court and others could help us. Those with information about corruption could help us as well to clean up, some of the corruption and so on that's in the Lebanese system. I do think we are at a moment in Lebanon of particular possible potential. And I think it's up to us to do it the right way and to seize this moment. But the pitfalls are many. There's no doubt about that.
I'm afraid we are way over time because we started late. So I'm just going to thank our panelists on that note. Paul, Lama, Minister Yassin, big thank you to all of them for doing what they're doing.